At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Welcome to the Parent Footprint Podcast with Dr. Dan. I'm your host, Dr. Dan. At Parent Footprint, our goal and mission is to create a loving world with more compassionate people, one parent and one child at a time. We firmly believe the key to raising happy, healthy, and engaged kids are for us parents to seek the same things, to be happy, to seek happiness, to be engaged in our life, to be aware of ourselves, of others, and our parenting. And by being aware, we can create our own vision of successful parenting by being the people we want our kids to become. Today's show is with Dr. Ty Tashiro. Dr. Ty wrote this amazing book, which we're going to talk about today, calling Awkward, the science of why we're socially awkward and why that's awesome. And today's show is why being socially awkward is awesome. A little bit about Ty. Dr. Ty is the author of Science of Happily Ever After. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time.com, TheAtlantic.com, NPR, and Sirius XM Stars Radio. He received his PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota and has been an award-winning professor at the University of Maryland and University of Colorado, and has addressed TED at New York City, Harvard Business School, MIT's Media Lab, and the American Psychological Association, and he currently lives in New York City. Dr. Ty, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Dr. Dan.
Okay, Ty, so let's start with, how did this book come to be? Awkward.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. About 3 or 4 years ago, it just so happened that I had a lot of friends in their 20s who had moved to new cities or were in new jobs. And I had observed that these friends who were socially awkward were having such a tough time adjusting to these new environments. And I found that so interesting because these were people that I knew well, and I knew that they had a great character. They were generous, kind people. They were smart. They were interesting. And they just struggled with these initial moments of social interactions. And I thought, gosh, if they could just skip the first 5 minutes of social interactions, they'd probably be a lot better off, because then people could discover who they really are.
So they needed to get beyond the first 5 minutes. Is that where everything crashes? That's where the potential train wreck happens?
It's pretty heavily concentrated there. That was my observation. And so then I had the idea to maybe write a book about it. And as I got into the social science research, I saw that was oftentimes the case, that these studies were showing that it was these initial moments of social interaction where awkward people really struggle. And once an interaction gets going and once they gain comfort with people, that's when they really start to be okay. And I think most people are like that, whether they're awkward or not. But that difference between those initial moments of interaction and then the longer term interactions are more sharply pronounced for people who are socially awkward.
So what what are the characteristics of being awkward? What does that look like? How do we define that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I could give you a psychological definition of that, but I always like to start with the root of the word awkward, which is an Old Norse word, afagur. And afagur means facing a different direction. And I really like that because it explains why awkward people might miss social cues or social expectations that everybody else sees. But it also says that they're looking at unique things or through a unique lens, and that could provide unique value to other people or to a group. And that suggests that there's an upside to being awkward. And it also maps on well to the social science data about how awkward people think about the world and function. And now if we provide a more psychological definition, it's really three things. It's social skill deficits, communication problems, and what I call obsessive interests, this tendency to get really excited and narrowly focused on a specific area of interest.
So if you have those characteristics and you're not necessarily looking towards people to look at their facial expressions or responses to you, there can be some awkward and unsuccessful interactions.
That's exactly right. So there actually are eye tracking studies that are really fascinating. They can, in the laboratory, assess within millimeters where your pupils are focused on a computer screen or in a room. And what they find is that, what most people do when they're in a social interaction is they reflexively look to the eye region of people's faces. And that's an adaptive sort of thing to do in a social interaction because the eye region is so rich in emotional cues. This idea that you can see it in their eyes, that you can decipher what someone is thinking, is actually true. There's psychological research to show that that's the case. Now, awkward people, by comparison, tend to reflexively look at the chin or the edge of the ears when they talk to somebody. And those are far less information-rich areas, of course. So from the very start, awkward people are behind in the interaction and behind in gathering important information that they need to understand what the other person's mindset might be.
And I was just reflecting as you're talking on a recent podcast where I kept saying about this topic we were talking about that, this is hard for people to make these changes. And our guest said, it's actually not hard. People are never taught. So I'm thinking about, this piece of information that, of course, you write about in your book, and what we're talking about today is, it seems critical that we would teach people of all ages something as simple as where are you looking and where to look and what information that you might be able to get that could be helpful.
Yeah, you would think that that's the case, right? You would think at the very least we'd have maybe one class along the way in kindergarten or first grade and teach everybody how to do this. But, the prevalence studies show that about maybe 15 to 20% of people are awkward. So, they're in this minority group. And what happens with most people who aren't awkward, people I would call socially fluent, is they naturally pick up on these things. So they naturally know to look to people's eyes, or they naturally know to stand about 18 inches away from somebody when they're talking to them. And no one has to tell them that. They pick it up just like a kid would pick up grammatical rules or vocabulary. But awkward people, for them, social interaction is a bit like speaking in your second language.
Right. So you talk about heritability and percentage rates. I imagine, like many other things, males and females might have some different percentage points on this.
They do, yeah. The first question, I guess, is awkwardness heritable at all? And the answer to that is yes. It shows pretty substantial heritabilities. And for boys, it's about 52% heritable. For girls, it's about 39% heritable. So you do see that sex difference there. You also see a difference in the amount of familial influence. So when we think about the environmental factors that influence someone's level of social awkwardness, girls are more influenced by the family environment than boys are.
Really?
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay, so this is the nature nurture thing.
It is, yeah, and well, I think some of that has to do with just cultural expectations. some of these rules we've had about gender roles, which I'm agnostic about. It's fine for people to believe what they want to believe. But one of the problems that boys have more so than girls is they're not as empathically accurate as girls are. Boys aren't taught to recognize their feelings, to express their feelings, to recognize feelings in others and talk about others' feelings. They're just not as good at that coming out of childhood compared to girls. And so this increased influence of the familial environment on girls might be the fact that they're just more relationally attuned. And that doesn't mean that the familial environment will make them more awkward necessarily. It could mean that the familial environment makes them less awkward because they're paying more attention to what their parents are saying about social interactions, or observing their parents and how they do things and using that modeling to correct their social behavior.
Does your research or the literature suggest that there is a greater impact or negative impact for males versus females about being socially awkward? It's how they're received by others?
Yeah, well, a lot of my female friends love to hear this finding, which is that men are about twice as awkward as women. So there's 2 times the prevalence rate. Right. You didn't really need social science to tell us that. So
it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, right. But but there are actually studies that show not only at the behavioral level or the emotional level that boys tend to be more awkward than girls are, but you also see some biological evidence in brain imaging research that boys show more of a propensity towards awkward neural patterns that lead to awkward behaviors or difficulty with social skills.
And I know that in your book, you talk about how people who are considered, quote, gifted tend to be more likely be socially awkward. And it's making me think of a lot of the work that I do and that we do at the center. We see a lot of individuals who are considered gifted. And I find that this is this nature-nurture thing, that sometimes you get parents who would self-proclaimed awkward who have kids that are awkward. And there isn't a lot of stress. There might not be a lot of stress around that because it's just kind of that's the way we are. However, sometimes that parent who had a lot of difficulty growing up and doesn't want their child to experience that the same way. And then conversely, you might have one parent who was, I believe you said, socially fluent, has good social skills, has always had good social skills. And then they have this socially awkward child that just doesn't resonate for them. And they're really worried. So I imagine you see all of these different combinations out there.
You're exactly right about all those different descriptions. And that's been one of the really interesting things since the book came out a few months ago, is hearing from parents who have a really strong reaction to some of these messages. And they're saying, it's great to hear you describe my son or daughter, and to know that it's okay, and things are going to be all right, but that there's steps that we can take to help them adjust socially and help them find that sense of belonging that's so important to any child or adolescent or adult for that matter. But you see, if it's heritable, then it's pretty likely that one of the parents is awkward. Once in a great while, you see it skip a generation, where neither parent is awkward. That was my case. Both of my parents were very socially fluent. And then I came along and was certainly far more awkward than they were. I think the thing that underlies how parents deal with this successfully is twofold. One, they're patient about it and they're not overreactive. It's so easy to get panicked about an awkward child not quite fitting in. But one of the worst things to do with an awkward child is to up the emotional intensity of a situation that's already difficult. Their brains are kind of ill-equipped to handle intense emotion compared to non-awkward kids. And so if you push them into that, if you accelerate that emotion for them, amplify it, they're likely to shut down or react in a way that's less than optimal. Just using even a calm tone of voice when a kid is struggling socially or doing something that's pretty socially awkward. That can have a huge effect. And, most awkward kids, deep down, they want to learn the skills. Like, they want to learn how to fit in and how not to stress out about some of these routine social interactions. So yeah, I think being calm, avoiding being overreactive. The second thing is that parents who successfully, raise an awkward child is that they get more specific about things that everyone else would take for granted. And so I give this example in the book of the Wendy's parking lot. And so when we would go to Wendy's to get a hamburger, they'd park the car, my parents would turn around to the back seat, and they'd say, "It's time to mentally prepare." And I knew exactly what this meant. And this would be a kind of Socratic dialogue where they would say, "So where are we at and why are we here?" "We're at Wendy's, we're here to eat." And then they might say something like, "So what's the first thing you need to look for when you walk inside the door?" And what they wanted for me to say was, I need to see whether there's a line or not, and if there is a line, to go to the back of it. Just because sometimes I was so airheaded, I was facing a different direction, right? And so I just wouldn't see the line. I wasn't trying to, cheat anybody or get in front. I just didn't see it sometimes. And so they would have to go through these really specific things, like, figure out what you want to order, get your money ready. Don't turn around really quickly and hit someone with your tray, And this would go on until I was, 12, 13 years old, which is way past the point parents would do that with a kid, right? And they had to do it dozens and dozens of times. But eventually I learned these social scripts. It came naturally to other kids. And now it's the case. I don't have to think twice about these things, thank goodness. But it took a lot of persistence on their part and a lot of specificity.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
It's really important what you're saying. So first of all, the patience and how you even link that to brain development, because we know from the brain-based work of Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson and such that when our kids are upset, and then you add intensity and emotion and arousal, the brain just can't handle it. It particularly can't. Not only is there more of a freak out, but you can't teach. They're not in a receptive way. So it is so key for us to be calm in situations where we are feeling frustrated or embarrassed or whatever with our kids. And the other thing that I think is just key, that what you're saying, and I find in my work, is that how we have to break things down and help with the scripts to teach. That's what you're talking about, to teach. And what we forget, especially with kids that are on, average, above average, or more intelligence, we just make this assumption that if you are, in advanced math, or you can read at all these books, and then that when you go into a restaurant, you look to stand at the back of the line instead of going right up front. And that is, I think, we miss that. Right, we miss that when we make these assumptions that are not reality based on our kids' behavior.
Dr. Dan, that's so true. I think there's this misinformation in society that ability is uniform, right? So if you're good in one thing, you're good at everything else too. Right. And that's just simply not the case, especially with gifted kids. As you know, the more gifted they get, the more likely it is that they have uneven abilities, such that they're excellent in some areas and even sometimes below average in other areas. And this is true with with the social skills and the intellectual ability, especially when it comes to things like math and science or areas that are very method-based or systematically based. Kids gifted in those areas are much more likely to have social skill problems or problems with emotional intelligence. And that's okay. But as long as parents are calm and persistent and willing to be specific, then those kids will turn out just fine.
Mm-hmm. And so what would you say is the correlation or relationship between being awkward and then moving into anxiety and social anxiety?
Yeah, that was an interesting distinction to think about. Kind of think about the difference between those two things. Social anxiety, as one of the core components of that, is unreasonable worry about a pending social interaction. And I think for awkward kids sometimes, the worry is actually not unreasonable. When I was a kid, it was actually much more likely that I would mishandle a social situation compared to my peers. And so as long as that anxiety stayed in a range that was manageable, it was actually a positive thing for me, because that motivated me to think more about what to look for in a social interaction in advance, made me think about being more mindful once I was in the interaction, about doing things like listening, not speaking over people, being sure to be well-mannered and show interest. So I think it can be a positive thing. Obviously, if it tips into something where the child won't leave the house or become so overwhelmed in the moment they can't interact in a calm fashion, obviously that's not good. But although social anxiety and awkwardness are correlated, they're not perfectly overlapping.
No, and it's making me think about all the clients that I've worked with in situation with my own kids where you would almost want them to be a little anxious because sometimes they're so socially, they're awkward. They're turning the other way or naivete or clueless that they're actually not even picking up on enough information to even be anxious about the situation, right? We get that into the spectrum too, I imagine. Yeah.
Sure. Especially when we tell them it's okay, which has now made it even worse, right? So, I'm a big fan of calmly delivering, objective advice. Obviously, you got to pick your battles as a parent. But, if a kid does something that's awkward and is going to continue to rub people the wrong way going forward, I am so grateful that my parents would say, hey, and this is the way they would say it. This might be helpful for some of your listeners. But the way they would say it is, hey, Ty, when you don't say goodbye to people when you leave a discussion, it makes them feel like you didn't enjoy talking to them. And so they'd always phrase it as, when you do A, it makes people feel B. And that was a message that really resonated with me because I wanted to do right by other people. I wanted to be a good citizen or a good friend. And so that was a really good motivator.
That's a really good example. I know I've seen a lot too, breaking it down to some of these kids, something as simple as, do you know when you don't say hi back, they think you don't like them? And these kids would be like, what? Really? Wow, I like them. And it's like, so you just put connect A to B. It can make the world a difference for someone.
It certainly can. It certainly can. And that's a great example there of the awkward kid's tendency to assume that their mental state of mind, their mindset, is shared. They don't always understand that there has to be this communication, this actually the spoken word to communicate those things that are in their head.
So let's move to why being socially awkward is awesome. So because we're all about strength-based, right? Like there is awesome stuff here.
Absolutely. And I think, one good example of this was I had this friend and they're having difficulty with their 9-year-old who was very, very strong-willed and very gifted too. And I said, look, that stubbornness that you see that's driving you crazy right now, I'm not minimizing how crazy that's probably driving you. That stubbornness is going to turn into determination in the right context. And some of these unique ways that the awkward kids see the world, these unusual understandings they have or these unusual curiosities, that can turn into creative energy later on. And so all these things that trip them up when they're younger, if they channel those into the right context as they become adolescents and adults, all of a sudden those things become great strengths. And when they combine together, they can produce really extraordinary outcomes. If you go through the history of people who have achieved some pretty special things, you oftentimes find that there was this social discomfort, that there was this obsessive interest in something that they loved so much more than anybody else, that they decided to persist and to dig deeper than anybody else was willing to do. And I think, across the board, not all awkward kids are gifted, not all gifted kids are awkward.
Right.
But I think the thing about awkward kids that's uniformly awesome is that they really do tend to love whatever they're interested in. And they have this passion and this exuberance for those things that is just great to see. I loved what Gino Ariema, the women's basketball coach at UConn, said in a press conference about a year ago. They asked him, why do you have the most successful program in the history of women's basketball? And he said, the key to that is that we recruit enthusiastic kids. He said the cultural pressure is to be cool, right? To be aloof, to be disengaged. The thing you got to love about awkward kids and their nerdiness is that they're just unafraid. They're unapologetic about being really passionate about the things that they love.
They're all in. All in.
They are. They are. They've got to, they'll learn some ways to temper that in certain situations, or to introduce people to their passion in a graded kind of way, so it doesn't overwhelm other people. But yeah, I think that's one of the real dangers is accidentally squelching their unique interests or squelching the enthusiasm that they have in the rush to get them to fit in.
Exactly. And, your words of wisdom about patience and being patient with our kids in situations, being patient with their development, because as you point out, what that looks like at age 5 and age 10 and age 15 and age 20, it changes over time. And there's a lot of pressure on parents these days to produce these successful all-around mainstreamers. And we have to accept our kids where they are and help them grow and help them find their way, because that's that awesome stuff that they possess.
That's one of the most loving things I think a parent can do, right? Is to get their kid in that way and say, hey, we realize you're unique and you might have some particularly strong interests, not necessarily as broad of interests. We want to encourage you in some of these ways that we think will help you in life, and they'll be necessary. But the deal is then we'll support these great passions that you have.
And this is perfect timing and transition to our parent footprint question, the parent footprint moment question. And that's where, Dr. Ty, you tell us and our listeners about a time when you became more aware of yourself as an individual or as a parent or as a child of your parents, where you gained an awareness about yourself for them, and that awareness had a positive impact on your life.
One of the things that was really impactful to me, this is going to be one of these things that sounds like a minor detail maybe to outsiders, but to me was very meaningful. I had this odd interest as a child in baseball statistics, and I just didn't like them. I was obsessed with them. And so I had actually memorized all of the earned run averages for every National League pitcher. I could tell you most of their win-loss records updated each week. And I just had a good memory for these things. I liked creating equations and manipulating those numbers. And that's unusual for a 10-year-old boy to be doing those things. And, my parents, it probably made them nervous that I was doing that, because they probably thought to themselves, when he gets to junior high, this is exactly the kind of thing that can get you in social trouble. My dad had bought me this encyclopedia of statistics books for my birthday, for my 10th birthday. And the Sporting News published these. It was a 5-volume set, and it just had thousands and thousands of statistics in it. I loved it. And I would spend hours and hours poring over that. And the message that sent to me was that hey, we support this thing that you're really passionate about. We support this thing that's an unusual interest of yours, and we're willing to nurture that, even if that makes us a little bit nervous at times.
Yeah.
But that was, that was a good deal for me because, it was important to have me know that my parents understood that quirk about me and would support it. And then that made me more receptive to the deal, which was that, okay, I'll work harder at my social skills and be more attentive to those kinds of things in return.
That's awesome. So, feeding your passion, and not only feeding your passion, but that act is an acceptance of who you were and what you were about, as opposed to, let's try to do a mainstream thing here and get away from this stuff, right? They fully accepted this thing about you.
Exactly. And it's just so meaningful at a time when, 10 years old, there is starting to be that pressure to fit some sort of specified norm, right? And it's for your parents who you think are not cool, right, or don't get things, say, no, we get you, man, and we know this is where you're at. And even though everybody else might not be moving the same direction, we're actually going to move with you and lean in to this thing that you're really interested in and this thing you really love.
And that is awesome. That is awesome. Thank you all for listening today to Dr. Ty educate us and impart his wisdom about why being socially awkward is awesome. Definitely check out his new book, Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. And as all of you can hear, this is a very awesome and socially fluid guy who has a history of being awkward and is still awesome. Dr. Ty, where can people learn more about you and find out what you're doing?
They could just go to awkwardbook.com and find out anything they want to know over there.
Dr. Ty, thanks for joining us today and providing inspiration to all of you parents out there who might be awkward, who might be raising some awkward kids. Remember, you're awesome. Thanks for listening today, everyone. Check us out at www.parentfootprint.com. Continue to try to be the person you want your child to become. Show them the way by your actions. Work on your awareness. And I'll leave you with that question I always do. What footprint do you want to leave?